thought that now we're finally going to get some meaningful changes in our gun regulations, it all dies. And when you say the best lobbyists and the best media that money can buy, it is stunning how little money it takes for gun manufacturers to control our media and to control our Congress. But, the way our election system works, I mean, I don't know if you've been over here during a campaign, but somehow Germany, Great Britain, has been able to limit the amount of time that a political campaign goes on. In the United States, Barack Obama didn't win re-election before pundits were discussing who the nominees were going to be in the next presidential election. It takes so much money to run for public office now that they are literally selling themselves to their sponsors.
All right, let me step back a little bit. I didn't get an opportunity to introduce Harry officially, properly to KCAA listeners, to Roseanne Barr Live listeners. So let me tell you a little bit about Harry. Harry Fear is a British journalist and campaign documentary maker. He works independently as a freelancer. He and I host together a show on Saturday on this station at 11 a.m. Palestine Today, where we focus exclusively, I don't want to say exclusively, but we have, our slant is pro-Palestinian. So check out that show, Palestine Today, on KCAA with Harry Fear and I. Harry Fear regularly lectures around the world on his work in Gaza and regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict. And as I mentioned before, he just came back from a 20-minute talk in Copenhagen. I'm so proud of him. He's my co-host. I'm so proud that Harry Fear gave a TED. I'm jealous because I want to talk at TEDx. But I'm so proud of Harry's talk. That talk is up on Roseanne Barr's website, which is roseanneworld.com. Harry, why don't you tell listeners about your experience in Gaza? You've been living there a while. Share that with the listeners, please.
Well, I'm not there at the moment, but I've lived there on and off since last summer, 2012. And, there are two sides to Gaza, which are both, in a way, not really, I would say, covered, certainly for the American audience. The first is that there is such a reality which should sadden us and horrify us. Which is most critical for us to pay attention to. And then there's another reality, which is that there is an incredible ability for people to have just continued steadfastly in the face of epic criminality of occupation. And both are very, humanistically important. But just to talk a little bit about the sort of the criminality which isn't covered. Palestinians in Gaza are now about 1.8 million. It's very simple, the facts, and very, very stark. Most of them are children. It's a very young population. Cultural reasons for this and others. Secondly, most of them are refugees, if not from the creation of Israel or the Six-Day War, from other escalations or bouts of violence or wars since then. And also, most of the population, again about 2/3, are reliant on humanitarian assistance from the United Nations to support them. And so, not to mention that most of the population are living in refugee camps. And these aren't refugee camps like we have associated with the Syria conflict or Iraq war, but these are refugee camps which have been in place for decades, because the Palestinians who have been refugee displaced for decades are waiting to return. But that's a more technical topic. But you can see from these simple facts that the reality is absolutely stark. Before you even add to that, number one, the blockade and besiegement of this people by land, sea and air, basically trapping them in. And speaking today and for the last week or so, Palestinians have been basically locked in a very small coastal enclave on and off by Egypt and Israel as part of this medieval and totally extraordinary act of hostility and barbarism, locking in the 21st century 1.8 million people into a tiny space. That's just the blockade. then to mention the violence and the wars and Israel's attacks on Gaza, and the Israeli state spokespersons say and admit on TV. I was just watching a clip earlier, Jeremy Bowen interviewing an Israeli state spokesperson, where the spokesperson basically admits that the idea was of war on Gaza to terrorize the population, to have absolutely disproportionate force used. I'm using my words, but they allude to this and imply this, and to inflict, basically 100 more casualties on the Palestinian side than on the Israeli side. That was how they set out to war on Gaza. And I was in Gaza last November in 2012 and covered thoroughly the war as it broke and went on. And I can tell you from the depth of my soul that having been there, I have no doubt with any part of my being that operation and the reality around it, the political reality, the moral reality, the PR reality that seeks to justify it, is wrong with a capital W, and will only lead to perpetual violence and a cycle of violence. And for me, I wouldn't categorize our work on the Palestine Today show on Saturdays as pro-Palestinian. I would sort of call it pro-life, because what's going on at the moment is wrong with a capital W by any standard.
I don't think that we should call anything pro-Palestinian, pro this or pro that, if what you're trying to do is be factual. Now, granted, again, there's always going to be a slant to any way that you deliver information. But I would love to hear, Harry, as one who spent time there documenting what's going on, what you think the long-range solution is. One of the articles that I published a couple of years ago that I received hate mail for months, I made the observation that we had a European crime, the Holocaust, and we solved it with Palestinian real estate, and that solution is unacceptable, and that what really should have happened would have been to create a Jewish homeland, partially in Germany and partially in Poland, because that's where the largest number of population of the Jews were executed. Now, I understand at the time that there were a lot of Jews that were literally afraid to be repatriated to that portion of Europe. But this situation where we've taken an island of land in the Middle East, displaced residents, and hope that maybe a generation or two later people would forget. And we could, you can strike up a wonderful conversation in a bar in Dublin about British abuse of the Irish. You can go down to Miami and talk to Cuban expats that somehow think that 60 years later there's eventually going to be an invasion of Cuba and the Castro land redistribution will be undone and they're going to get their plantations back. But at what point does a redistribution of land or a confiscation of land, when is that ever over? And could it ever really be over in Palestine?
Well, if it's important to look at the kind of moral context. If we take the situation with the USA, basically the land is stolen, there's been process of genocide and etc. And
don't talk about Wales and Scotland now.
Well, where does one start? The American radio station. But this is it's as you say, it's part of human history. But the point with the Israel-Palestine conflict is that there is a broad consensus that there should be a resolution which provides at least some justice for Palestinians, and obviously that sort of consensus doesn't exist for the situation in North America. So the point is that with the Israel-Palestine conflict, there is a sensitivity to the plight of the Palestinians, and that's an important starting base. Now, in terms of analysis, it's very important to discern that the general international, political consensus and the basic legal consensus is that there should be two states for two peoples. Now, the problem is that really, in sort of practical reality, both sides now, on the Israeli and Palestinian side, they don't really accept that. and but the main obstacles to resolution are really the foreign policies of Israel and the United States. I mean, the United States foreign policy is such a driving force, and it's so much aligned in its aggressiveness and hegemony with the Israeli foreign policy. It's impossible almost to imagine a world without that kind of domination. And I think it's equally difficult to imagine a world without, with a resolution for the Israel-Palestine conflict while that American foreign policy domination still exists. And if we just look specifically, the prolonging of the Israel-Palestine conflict has been historically perpetuated by American interference. It really does so much come back down to the American interference. And I can't see how a two-state solution can really be cemented in the long term. I could see actually in the medium term it being cemented. I could see that the settlers in the West Bank are recalled like they were in Gaza. That has happened historically. It would just have to happen on a larger scale in the West Bank. So I don't see that as an absolute barrier to a two-state solution. But what I do see is, as one activist, pro-Palestinian activist based in London put it, if you have a two-state solution and there's one rocket that goes from the new Palestinian state into the Israeli state, Palestine is basically one payload away from destruction, and the Israeli state will have a fantastic pretext to have a massively disastrous bombing campaign against Palestine. And so I just don't see how such small pieces of land, with all of the historic conflict, can be carved up in this two-state solution. I can't see how that can work on a long-term basis. And if you look at what's going on in Israel today with the base racism, and it's not racism against Arabs anymore, it's racism against anyone that is not, sorry to say, Jewish. I didn't decide that it was Jewish, the Israeli state did, but it's anyone that is not Jewish. There is a predisposition for racism, and that's what's happening now with the so-called infiltrators, which are basically immigrants or migrants fleeing persecution and economic prospects. You're seeing now a massive racism against blacks in Israel, as well as Palestinians, Arabs. And that's just not sustainable, and that's getting worse. And there is hope in that the worse it gets, the closer it is to midnight before that situation becomes addressed by the international community, because it is getting worse, and particularly in Israel with this new racism, it's called, against blacks. It looks just like South Africa, and I think people are very sensitive about that. And I have hope that the book can be closed with this injustice, but it's difficult to find reasons to be hopeful, really. But I think that at the end of the day, when racism is one of the core problems prolonging the conflict and the oppression, and so long as Palestinians are not giving up, and they're definitely not giving up, and are able not to give up, just look what they've achieved in Gaza under years of blockade. They've managed to build kind of civilization there. It seems to me that at the end of the day, these peoples are basically going to have to live together. And then we have brought in the idea of one-state solution, which then looks very airy-fairy and happy days and rainbows and gold pots. But really, I don't know how you can have any other solution. I don't think the one-state solution is realistic. I don't think the two-state solution is realistic. But I think the two-state solution is probably more unrealistic.
Harry, I want to complicate this. You say you can't even imagine a solution there, but let's say that the real energy and finances and military technology that has made it such a desperate situation has been the American need to have a partner in the Middle East because of our addiction to